All right, good morning, everyone. I hope you're staying warm out there. This is Protecting Hemlocks from Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. Today we're going to learn about the role hemlock trees play in forest ecosystems, how hemlocks are prioritized for management of forest pests, and of course, how you can help protect Adirondack hemlocks. So my name is Sean Kittle. I'm the communications manager with the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. I'm not going to be doing much talking today, though. Today we have Carolyn Marschner. She'll be up first. She's the outreach coordinator for the New York State Hemlock Initiative. And then we have Jason Denham, Supervising Forester for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Ari Giller-Leinwohl. He's the Terrestrial Invasive Species Manager for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And here's just a quick overview of what today looks like. If you read the event description, this is not going to be a surprise for you. We're going to kick it off with an overview of hemlocks, a little bit of information on HWA management, hemlock prioritization. We're going to talk about why hemlocks are important to Adirondack ecosystems. We're going to get into the Lake George Hemlock Project, how trees and sites are selected and how treatments are done. And then Ari's going to wrap it up with our volunteer Forest Pest Hunters program. He'll talk about how to identify HWA and hemlock trees, how to adopt a trail, and a brief intro to IMAP invasives. And then we'll have a Q&A, and we generally will do kind of a short Q&A after each speaker. And then at the end, we'll have kind of a bigger Q&A just to catch anything that we might have missed. If you're not comfortable, I ask everyone with a group this size to type your questions into the chat. So if you have a question, and you can do it while the speaker is talking, but please do not interrupt the speaker as they're talking. We'll have a little time, like I said, at the end of their presentations to do that. So if you could just type your questions into the chat, we can kind of go through them systematically. Then if there's any, any time left over, you can come off of mute and ask those questions. But we just kind of try to keep it a little bit simple so people aren't just shouting out questions all at once. All right, and I just want to tell you really quick, if you didn't know already, what is APIPP? APIPP is actually one of 8 partnerships for regional invasive species management across New York State. We were the first one, and our service area is the Adirondack Park, and we go all the way north up to the Canadian border. You can kind of see it on this map here. We are funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, which is administered by the New York State DEC, and we are housed in the Nature Conservancy's Keene Valley office, which is in the Adirondacks. So our mission is to work in partnership to minimize the impact of invasive species on the Adirondack region's communities, lands, and waters. And since invasive species are primarily spread by human activity, our outreach efforts largely revolve around public education and prevention. Frankly, it's a lot easier to prevent invasive species from spreading than it is to deal with them once they're here. And we also empower the public through trainings where we teach people to identify invasive species and to do their own management in some cases. Out in the field, our team is able to focus on priority infestations. We're able to work on land, and we're also able to work in aquatic spaces as well. And we have partnerships with more than 30 organizations around the region. And those partners are really, really important because they help us amplify our efforts. They help us reach more people. They help us basically cover more ground. We have a huge 6 million plus area that we're covering, and our team is very small. So we really rely on these partners, and we really appreciate their work. We have also a lot of volunteers who have been with us, some of them more than 20 years, and they're out there surveying lakes and trails and reporting any invasive species that they find. So Ari's going to get more into that and how you can get involved through our Forest Pest Hunters program. And we also have a Lake Protectors program, and we'll have a webinar on that in a couple months, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So you can, I should also let you know, we can go to www.adkinvasives.com if you want to learn more about the work we do. And with that, I will hand it over to Carolyn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me get my slides rolling here, which I could do if this giant thing wasn't. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hemlock trees and why they're so important. Hemlocks are a very common tree in New York. 10 years ago when I started giving this presentation, I'd say they were the 3rd most common tree in New York, and they aren't anymore. They're a foundation species, which means that they create the ecosystem that other species depend on to live. They fill a pretty unique ecosystem niche in our area. They're a very shade-adapted hemlock. They're a very shade-adapted conifer, which is unusual. And so they tend to grow in our valleys and ravines. They prefer fairly wet habitats, although they are not forced to grow only in wet habitats. And they can photosynthesize with very small amounts of light, which is why they do better in those shady places. They support over 400 species, birds, mammals, arthropods. There are more spiders in hemlock forests than there are in the surrounding forests, more different kinds of spiders. They're also called the ever-feeding tree. As the snow falls in the wintertime, if the droopy branches of the hemlock get pulled down so that animals on the ground can continue to feed on those branches through the winter. They also provide a unique habitat for aquatic ecosystems. They keep snow on the ground later into the spring than other kinds of forest around them, and so they provide cold water recharge into streams, helping keep the streams cooler. They also provide direct shade over streams, very dense shade, which helps to keep streams cool, which is important in places like the Adirondacks where you have great cold water fish habitat, like trout habitat. So they help keep freshwater streams cold and clean, which is important. And they're facing a challenge across the East Coast. And this is what forests are looking like these days in Pisgah National Forest down in the Adirondack, in the Appalachian region. This is what we'd like to avoid here. This is the pest that's causing that damage, Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. We're here to talk about today. There are hemlocks in many regions of the world. Here they all are. And there are HWA in a lot of those places. HWA is native to these areas in Asia, and it moved over into the Western United States many, many, many thousand years ago and functions as a native there. It's just us over here on the East Coast in the heavily glaciated region where our hemlocks have not had any kind of exposure to this kind of predator before. So HWA arrived in New York in the 1980s and moved through the lower Hudson and then into the Finger Lakes region and started moving through the Catskills. This is the early teens here. And now it's all the way up into the Lake George watershed and moving into the Tug Hill area as well, along the lake plain. This is what it looks like in the Adirondack area right now. All of the red dots are HWA. So you can see it's gotten pretty common in the Lake George watershed, but we're not seeing it outside the watershed yet, except for right along the edge of the APIPP prison boundary. There's a closer in look at the Lake George watershed. Some of the newer finds are right up in this area where we hadn't seen it until just in the last few weeks. I must be going the wrong way here. There we go. And here's every place that we've looked in the last 18 months or so. So there's been a lot of search activity in the Adirondacks, but we keep finding new stuff all the time. So it's really critical to have lots of boots on the ground looking for this pest so that we understand how it's spreading in the Adirondacks. So HWA looks like this white woolly mass that grows on the twig at the base of the needles. This is where it likes to land, right there. And this is what they look like if you strip the wool away and magnify greatly the insect underneath. The little pores up here on its plates is where it makes its wool. And then this long, silly straw looking thing is actually its mouth parts that it sticks down into the twig of the hemlock. And the HWA pulls starches out of the hemlock twig that the tree made for its own use. And it's not actually the feeding that kills the hemlocks. Our understanding is that the hemlocks busily wall off each one of those little wounds that the HWA make. If you have one or two, HWA, it's not a big deal. But if you have a dense infestation, like you saw in the previous slide, it makes it so that the twig itself gets damaged, and then the plant can't get sap out to the end of the twig to make new tissue and new needles. And then when the old needles eventually stop working and fall off, then the plant starves. And we're pretty sure that's what actually kills the trees. HWA, the mortality due to HWA is very, very high, and it usually takes between 4 years to about 20 years for a tree to die. And how long it takes depends on how many cold winters you have in that window. Down in the south, it's more like 4 to 10 years to mortality from infestation to tree mortality. Up in the northern parts of New York, it can be quite a long time, more on the 20-year range, but we have more winters like we have the last couple of winters, maybe not. HWA is 2 generations a year. They lay their overwintering eggs in the early summer. And then they grow into adulthood and that overwintering generation lays their eggs in the spring, in late March, early April. And then the spring generation grows very quickly, and then they lay those early summer eggs that start the cycle over again. When they first hatch, they look like this rather cute little thing, which is called a crawler. You can see it doesn't have much in the way of legs, but it's very, very small. So they don't move around well by themselves, but they can be blown on wind. They can crawl onto the feet of birds, we believe, and get moved around that way. This is the only stage in which HWA can move from one location to another. So the crawlers hatch, they go find a suitable place to settle down, they put their mouth parts into a tree, and that is it. They can't move again after that. And if they are dislodged from that location, they die. In the summertime, that overwintering generation, once it settles, it looks like this, and then it just hangs out over the summer in an inactive state called estivation. It's like hibernation, that happens in the summer. And then in the fall, they wake up and start putting on wool. This is what they look like over the summer. They're very small and hard to see, which is why we tend to suggest people survey in the winter. Because this is what they look like in the winter. Once they put on that wool that we believe they use to protect themselves from weather and predators, and they also lay their eggs in that wool. Once that wool is produced, they're a lot easier to see. This is what it looks like from about November to June. Each adelgid lays between 50 and 100 eggs. So you've got, you know what, I'm just going to skip this slide. I just told you all that. So the issue is they reproduce asexually. They're all females on this side of the continent. And so any individual can start a new infestation. They have 2 generations per year, so they have 2 opportunities for exponential growth. And there are no native HWA predators, so they're not getting a lot of pressure on that population from being eaten. So we have uncontrolled growth that causes this kind of population, and that is what's killing our trees. Once HWA has arrived, there are short-term and long-term management options. Short-term, we're really looking at chemical treatment of the HWA. In the long-term, the options are biological control or lingering developing some kind of hemlock, HWA-resistant hemlock. The 2 chemicals that are the most used for HWA are imidacloprid, which takes about a year to become effective, but then it lasts for between 3 to 7 years with an average of about 5. It used to be widely available, but that is changing. And as of June of this year, I believe, you will need to hire somebody to apply it for you. Dinotefuran works right away within a few weeks, but it's gone in a year, and it can only be applied by applicators. There are several different application methods if you're using imidacloprid. You can apply it to the stem through basal bark application or stem injection, or you could put it in the soil around the tree through soil drench or soil injection or time-release tablets. If you want to add on the dinotefuran, the fast-acting one, then in New York, you are restricted to basal bark application because that's the only way you can apply dinotefuran in New York. So there are 2 long-term options. The first one I'm going to talk about is biological control, which is the meat and potatoes of our lab at the New York State Hemlock Initiative. This is a long-term solution. Once biological control is using a natural predator or pathogen to naturally control a pest. Once that biological control is established on the landscape, it's a long-term solution. You don't have to do anything further. The biological control is handling the problem for you. And it's something that works at the landscape scale, whereas there's no way we're ever going to be able to treat our entire landscape of hemlocks with chemicals. Now, the issue is that we're all collectively still working on this solution, and it could be a while before this is really something that is on the landscape and saving trees. So if you want to save the trees you have today, chemical treatment is really your option. Here are the bugs that we work with. We work with the Laricobius beetles. The ones that we use most commonly are from the Pacific Northwest. They feed on the winter generation, that overwintering generation of HWA. We've been releasing them since 2009, and they have established at more than 17 sites in New York, and we're starting to find populations that have spread from those sites. So they're establishing really well in the warmer parts of the state. Doesn't do all that much for the Adirondacks. We are trying to release them in the Adirondacks, and we hope they will establish. Stay tuned. This is what they look like eating HWA. And these are the places where we've released them. You can see the size of the release, and you can see the stars are where they've established, and the little plus signs are where we found them where we didn't release. Silver flies are the other bug that we work with. The reason we're working with 2 bugs is that these guys, also from the Pacific Northwest, these feed on the spring generation, right? So you have those 2 opportunities for the population to rebound, and you really need a predator that hits both of those. These guys, it's actually their larvae that eat HWA, and they eat the eggs of the HWA. And we've been releasing them since 2017. Stay tuned to see if we can find establishment in New York. So this is what they look like. They're very, very small. This is a release tube, and that's somebody's hand. There's the larvae. This is our hero, the fly larvae, eating the HWA eggs. These are the eggs, and then this is the body of the adult HWA. And this is where we've released so far in New York. So we've been very active in the Lake George area with this predator because this one seems more well adapted to colder climates as compared to the Laricobius, which we are hoping will establish in Lake George, but stay tuned. The other long-term option is developing those resistant hemlocks that would have some sort of natural resistance to the HWA. And the Nature Conservancy is working hard on this in a project called Tree Species in Peril. And there's a smaller project that's called the Lingering Hemlock Project. Tree Species in Peril program is working on developing resistant strains of all of these different species 3 ash, beech, and hemlock to their predators. That would be EAB and beech bark disease and beech leaf disease, and then Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. A lingering hemlock is a hemlock that remains alive when at least 80% of the hemlocks near it have died. And so in the southern portions of eastern hemlocks range, they're totally, they've reached this quite some time ago, and they're actively searching for lingering hemlock now. The goal is to find any trees that have some level of tolerance to HWA and breed them together into a robustly resistant strain of HWA that we could then plant out into the landscape. Up here, we haven't reached that 80% mortality yet. And so in New York, we're working on setting up hemlock health monitoring plots so we can track hemlock mortality and see when we can start looking for lingering hemlocks. If you're interested in this, please reach out to Grace Haynes, who is my colleague, and she will help set up a training to help you understand how to do this. So once HWA has arrived, you need to figure out which trees you're going to save and how you're going to save them. So we've built a stand conservation tool that will help you walk through this. There's a Word document that you can just read that will talk about all the different factors that you might consider as you're deciding which trees to treat or which hemlocks to focus on conserving. And then if you are planning to put together some kind of grant, or you're managing a land trust and you need to deal with a lot of properties, there's an Excel spreadsheet you can use to get very quantitative about it. If you're on the leading edge of an infestation, you should probably treat. If you have old growth, please treat. And if you're going to take down the trees soon anyway, don't treat. Anything else, you can go through the tool and figure it out. You can figure out where your stands are, either by walking through your property or looking at an aerial image taken in the wintertime, and then go out and survey, score your properties, and think about which ones you're going to manage. A lot of people have questions about which treatment they should use. Should they be using imidacloprid alone, which is much less expensive than using both tools together, or should we use 2 tools together? The imidacloprid and the dimetaphyran. And we have a tool to help you walk through that. It's just a handout, really. And we have another handout to help you think through which trees you might want to treat. There are several regional projects that have used the prioritization tool, the hemlock conservation tool, to help them secure grants to get funding to treat hemlocks across their landscape, whatever that is. It's usually a watershed. So a lot of the lake associations and watershed associations in the Finger Lakes have done this. Skinny Atlas has, and Wasco Lake has. And that what you do is you develop a regional group that can reach out to hemlock property owners, train some volunteers to survey on those properties as you get permission, and then rank the properties, and then apply for funding. And then when you apply for funding, you can say, look, we've done our homework. We know what's going on in our landscape. We know what we need. We just need you to fund it. And that's a much stronger argument than we have hemlocks and we want to save them. So here's where all the regional plant projects are across the state. That is my talk for you, and I hope I left enough time for the other presenters.
You definitely did. Thank you, Carolyn. Much, much appreciated. We do have one question in the chat while Jason gets his slides all set up and ready to go. I'll read that to you. Gwen is asking, do we need to release and establish both the Larry beetle and the silverfly in order to control HWA long term?
That is a great question. And once we have them both established, we'll be able to answer it. But we think that that's the case. In the South, where they have very robustly established Larry populations, they see every winter they see a decline in their HWA populations, but then they just bounce back in the spring with that spring generation. And that's why we think we need both predators to control HWA. Now, in a place like the Adirondacks, your good, strong winters are doing the job of Laricobius, right? So you guys might not need a winter predator because you have winter is your predator. And then the spring predator can help with that spring rebound. But with the increasing uncertainty of having a cold winter, it's great to have both of them on the landscape, even in places that were traditionally quite cold. Does that answer the question?
Yes, Gwen says thank you. It says define cold weather, -15, -20.
It's a great question. And it's so the simple answer is -5. We start to see really good mortality, and -5 Fahrenheit. And at -15 Fahrenheit, we start to see very, very, very high. The slightly longer answer is it kind of depends on the weather that happens prior to your cold snap. If you have a really, really warm winter and then you have a cold snap that gets down to about 0 Fahrenheit, you can see some pretty good mortality then too, just because the bugs weren't acclimated to the cold.
Oh, God.
I will put Grace Haynes' contact information in there. I can't give you contact information for private citizens who have put together volunteer programs, but I can ask if they want to if they're willing to be contacted.
What I'm wondering, Carolyn, I'll send a follow-up email probably sometime tomorrow afternoon. If there's any information you want included in that, you could send it to me, and I'll send it out to everyone in that email.
Great. There are three other questions. I don't know what the twice-stabbed lady beetle is, so I can't answer about that for HWA. If it eats scale, that probably does not eat HWA. They're very different. They're in the same family, but they're very differently armored. There are issues applying treatments near rivers and wetlands, and I'm hoping that Jason will answer that, as he is a certified applicator and I am not. And how long the cold weather needs to last, -15 just overnight is enough. -5, probably one cold night will do some decent mortality, but the longer it lasts, the better. That is mostly me talking through my hat because I don't have any strong actual data for that.
Okay, let's move on to Jason. We're a little bit after 10:30, and we will have time for more questions at the end. So these are great questions. Please keep filing them into the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them after Jason. All right, thank you, Carolyn. Jason, it looks like you're all set up and ready to go.
Great. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. Well, as usual, my friend Carrie is a hard act to follow. I'm going to try and focus on sort of the more Adirondack-focused view of things and the status of hemlocks and HWA, but I'm going to be repeating a lot of the things that Carrie has already mentioned. So let's just hop right into it. Let's see. So I want to start a little bit with just some sort of historical context. Hemlock Woolly Adelgid is not the first time that hemlocks in the Adirondacks have faced a challenge. The tanning industry heavily utilized hemlock bark in the mid-1800s. Barbara Martin wrote that the Adirondack region had over 150 tanneries by 1850. And this was kind of like a brief period in industrial revolution history. The hemlock bark use in the tanning industry largely ended by the beginning of the 20th century. But during that time period, this was kind of the typical picture of what a hemlock bark harvest might look like in the Adirondacks. Generally, the wood was not worth pulling out of the woods. So they would fell the tree, remove the bark, take the bark with them, and leave these sort of the stripped stems there to decay over time. And, you know, a lot of people were alarmed by this by a certain point in our history. So I'm just going to read this. I'm sorry, not every one of my slides is going to be a wall of text, but what happened to the hemlocks? Early writers saw denuded hillsides with these rotting hemlock trees stripped of their bark. They lamented the destruction of these magnificent forests that had stood for hundreds of years. And this fear led into the perception at the beginning of the 20th century that the country at large had lost its wild forests forever, and that these hemlock forests were ruthlessly co-cut, wouldn't regenerate quickly. And then there was also some environmental degradation in the aftermath, eroded soil, silted streams. Some of the things Carrie talked about with why hemlock likes to grow in certain places also kind of influence how hemlock helps to control things like erosion and stream siltation. But despite all of this, hemlock has come back in a big way. It is, one can travel almost any road in New York and New England and Pennsylvania and spot these trees. And that the hemlock has returned is a testament to the inherent biological ability of the species to survive. This is from an article that Hugh Canham from ESF wrote several years ago now. Really interesting bit of history. But why am I talking about this history? I guess the reason I bring this up is just to point out that we're going to talk a lot about ecology, and we already have talked a lot about the ecology of hemlock. There's a pretty interesting cultural history and value of hemlock in the Adirondacks as well. And then the other reason I bring that up is just that, you know, there is a spark of hope even when these challenges happen, that changes we see can be overcome by a species. And I think I'll come back to that theme on some later slides, but I just kind of wanted to throw that in there to set some of the context for what hemlock looks like in the Adirondacks today. So first of all, hemlock bark, highly underrated. Hemlocks in general are, you know, considered by many, including myself, to be a highly aesthetically pleasing tree. I don't think the bark gets enough love. When I walk through a hemlock forest looking for Hemlock Woolly Adelgid or doing a treatment or for any other reason, the first thing I see is this beautiful dark ridged bark, and it's just a joy. As Carrie mentioned, hemlock it's either the third or the fourth most common stem in New York, depending on how you measure and what data source you use. So I'm hedging my bets here. I always say it's the third most common as well in New York State, but it may have slipped down to fourth depending on the data source. It is an ecological keystone species because of that shade tolerance, the amount of shade it casts as well, deeply affects the microclimate of sites in the Adirondacks. Carrie mentioned holding snow longer and sort of having that longer, slower release of cold water into streams helps to keep stream temperatures low, as well as the shade helping to keep stream temperatures low. So that's important for things like brook trout and other aquatic species. It's great winter habitat for wildlife. And it also has a really big impact on other plant life. If you walk through a healthy hemlock forest and look on the ground, you're going to see not a lot of sunshine and not a lot of other plant life, or a less variety of other plant life on the ground because of that deep shade. You might see, you know, quite a few mosses or other things that are adapted to that deep shade. But one thing you're not likely to find is a lot of invasive plants, which is a problem that can pop up in stands where you lose hemlock. You get a lot more sunlight onto the forest floor over time, and often the invasive plant species are the first species that are able to take advantage of that additional sunlight to occupy that space. So just a super, super important tree to the Adirondacks, to the state as a whole, but specifically the Adirondacks. You saw this map already, but just to point out, the density of New York State's hemlock is highest in the Adirondack region. That is sort of our hemlock breadbasket. And New York State probably has more hemlock trees than any other state in the US, partly because of that sort of ring of really dense hemlock around the Adirondack Mountains. The map on the right I threw in there just to sort of point out the overall range of eastern hemlock in North America. We're kind of smack dab in the middle of it. And the reason I bring that up is even with warming winters and warming climate, models indicate and common sense would suggest that New York State is still going to be a good hemlock habitat for the foreseeable future, even with climate warming. There may be some specific sites that become too warm or too dry for hemlock to thrive, but there's no reason to suspect that climate is going to drive hemlock out of the Adirondacks or out of New York State. Again, here's another map showing the distribution of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in New York State, and you can see that Lake George watershed area popping out there is like a long tendril reaching up into the Adirondack Mountains. We also have had Hemlock Woolly Adelgid found just outside of the blue line west of Great Sacandaga Lake, and one little tiny bit of infestation that we treated a year ago in the Wilcox Lake Wild Forest, which is to the southwest, the little green dot that's just a little bit down close to that blue line. I don't know if you can see my cursor if I use that as a pointer, but that one right there, that works. So,
we can see it.
Oh, thank you. Good. That's good to
You're
know.
welcome.
So now getting into the history of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in the Adirondacks, it starts back in 2017. This is long before we had found any Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, even very close to the Adirondacks. This was really a very lucky find. A visiting researcher was studying old growth hemlock in the Prospect Mountain area. This is the road you see on the map here is the Prospect Mountain Highway that goes up to the top of the mountain. It's a DEC property. And they found these 3 infested trees. At the time, this was about 40 miles away from the nearest HWA that was known, which would have been down in probably, I think, Schenectady County at that time. And only 3 infested trees were found. Immediately, DEC did a very broad survey of the area. A 5-mile radius was pretty intensively surveyed. We had tree climbers at this site. We had sampled and volunteer surveys and professional surveys from, basically all over the southern end of the Lake George watershed, trying to figure out if this was all of the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid that was there. At that time in 2017, it's all we found. Hindsight would lead me to think that it's probably not all that was there at the time, but it was all that was there at a detectable level. So DEC, with help from APIPP and TNC, actually assisted with the treatment of this site. And we treated about a 7-acre area with imidacloprid and dinotefuran to attempt to kill all the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid that at that time was known to be in the Adirondacks. Because of the label restrictions on imidacloprid specifically, it took us 3 years to be able to treat all the trees in this area because there's a limit to the amount of chemical that you can apply per acre per year. But we've continued to survey this area and had no additional detections from, post-treatment in this treated area or around it for the next several years. So at the time, we considered that a success and thought, ooh, that was a close call. And, then 2020 happened. So let me take the next phase or era of HWA in the Adirondacks. you can think of this as sort of the COVID era, if you wish. Started with a camper at Lake George campground on the eastern shore of the lake. I believe it was the Glen Island Campground Group. Reported seeing Hemlock Woolly Adelgid near their campsite. Sure enough, follow-up surveys eventually found over 400 infested trees detected. I think the first year it was only about 300. Along primarily the Paradise Bay area of Lake George. You can see also there's some detections around Pilot Knob and Shelving Rock. And that island there in the middle of the lake is Dome Island, a TNC property. So all of these red dots here are actually not the detections, but hemlocks that were treated, including infested hemlocks and hemlocks that were nearby to those infested hemlocks. Between 2020 and 2021, DEC, with help from many partners and staff from around the state, treated over 4,500 hemlock trees using the basal bark application method, using the tank mix of both of those chemicals, the dinotetraene and the imidacloprid. We also treated 650 trees by injection, by stem injection. And I'll get into that in a later slide, why some were done by injection. And then bringing us to the present day, you can see that sort of our mapping technology has changed over the years. So I want to explain sort of what you're looking at here. The little red star-shaped indicators are trees that were treated in 2022. And then trees that were treated in 2023 and 2024 are the sort of teal-colored teardrop pointer shapes on the map. We treated just over 2,700 trees during this time period in Lake George area. This, you will note, is fewer trees that were treated in 2020 and 2021, and I think that's indicative of two different things that were happening. One is that in 2020 and 2021, the Lake George area was the only place in the entire state where DEC put resources into treating hemlock trees. It was the first major incursion into the Adirondack Park, the breadbasket of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. There was some faint hope, even in 2020, that we might knock back the population enough to significantly slow the expansion of HWA in the area. In 2022 through to present day, essentially, Hemlock Woolly Adelgid by that time was pretty widespread, as Carrie mentioned, throughout the Lake George, certainly the coastal areas. We still don't find it very far away from water, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide too. But we've also been treating in other places around the state. So some of those DEC staff and money and resources that go to controlling Hemlock Woolly Adelgid have been focused in areas other than Lake George during this time period because it's become more of a widespread issue in this area. So I'll talk a little bit about how we at DEC manage HWA. Some of this will be, referring to the stuff that Carrie's already spoken about, but also about how, sort of the site selection and tree selection takes place and some of the factors that we have used in working in the Lake George area and the Adirondacks. And you might hear me say Lake George area a lot, sort of interchangeably with Adirondacks in this context, because, basically Lake George is where the game is for Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in the Adirondacks currently, and I hope it stays that way for a considerable time. Recognizing there's a lot more to the Adirondacks than the Lake George watershed, but that is not currently infested so far as we can detect. Okay, so Carrie mentioned also the two main pesticide options Imidacloprid being the slow chemical, slow to move through the canopy, but longer lasting control. Also, it's important to note that imidacloprid does not control elongate hemlock scale, which is another invasive insect of hemlocks that is starting to become more present in the Adirondacks. And also important to note that imidacloprid is the chemical that has sort of the lower amount that you are allowed to apply per year. It's actually written in the chemical label, which in New York State, the label is the law. You know, a certain amount of, I believe it's listed as ounces or grams per acre. Essentially, we do the math and figure out how much tree that means to us, how much tree we can treat. And the label limit at the rates that we are applying the chemical is equivalent to 256 diameter inches of hemlock tree per acre per year. So you measure the diameter of a tree at 4.5 feet off the ground, a breast height. And, you know, a typical tree would be somewhere between, you know, maybe 8 and 24 inches. For each acre that we treat, and we do measure this to make sure that we're in compliance with the label and the law, we can only treat 256 inches of hemlock per year. So some sites, that means you can't treat every hemlock in the first year. And if your goal is to treat every hemlock, you have to return the following year. Dinotefuran is a faster moving, faster acting, but also doesn't last for as long chemical. It also has the bonus of controlling elongate hemlock scale. So if we have a stand that has a significant scale component, we would certainly try to use dinotefuran as well as imidacloprid so that we could control both pests, at least for the short time. DEC has not to date treated any trees with dinotefuran only, simply because if you're going to treat with dinotefuran for a little bit more money and basically the same effort, you can also include imidacloprid in the same backpack sprayer and get a longer lasting control. So it is possible and allowed to treat with only dinotefuran, but it's not something that we have done. Dinotefuran also has a limit to the amount you can apply per acre per year, but it's a little bit higher than imidacloprid, so we don't really factor it into our calculations because we hit the imidacloprid limit first. With DEC, we have used both basal bark application and direct injection as our application methods. We have not, to date, done any soil applications for Hemlock Woolly Adelgid control. And I think that is also the case with our sister agency state parks who've done a lot of hemlock treatments in state parks. I wouldn't say that I would never use a soil application. I think there's some interesting science that's still being done on the environmental fate of imidacloprid that might indicate that in certain environments or situations, a soil application might be the appropriate way to go. But to date, we have only used basal bark and direct injection. The nice thing about basal bark is it's faster to do than direct injection. You can use both chemicals, so you can either use imidacloprid alone or you can mix imidacloprid and dinotefuran together. The downside is that it is not to be applied near surface water. So we use a setback from like a lakeshore, for example, like Lake George, where we wouldn't do a basal bark application on a tree that's too close to surface water. Also, you have some weather restrictions on when you can apply it because of the way you apply it is you put it on the bark and then it's absorbed through the bark into the tree. You shouldn't do it when bark is already waterlogged by rain or when precipitation is predicted within 24 hours. So there are some times of, you know, we might plan to do a treatment and the weather doesn't cooperate and then basal bark is not an option. We use direct injection as our method for trees that are too close to water to treat by basal bark application. When we do direct injection, there are some downsides. It takes longer to do. Basically, it requires drilling holes into the tree and then using air pressure to inject the chemical into those holes. And the uptake can be a little bit slower. It's a little bit more labor intensive, so that makes it more costly. The other potential downside with directing into the stem directly is you can get situations where the chemical doesn't disperse evenly around the whole circumference of the stem from those injection points, and you can get limbs that are essentially miss getting some of the chemical, and so you might effectively treat the tree but still have one limb or a few branches that are still infested by Hemlock Woolly Adelgid because they never got a dose of the chemical. But the main reason why we prefer basal bark application is that we're able to use both chemicals together, and it's, in the situations where we can use it, it's faster and easier to do. Therefore, it less labor. It's also less expensive to do, so we can do more. Timing of chemical control, if you're thinking about chemical control, it's all based on transpiration, right? So, this generic diagram, the plant takes up water from the soil, it moves it through its vascular system into the leaves, and that is evaporated from the leaf surface. We call that transpiration. And that's how things like nutrients move from the soil up into the top of the tree. Well, it's the same for the chemical. That's how the chemical moves from the base of the stem to throughout the canopy of the tree, where the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid gets exposed to it. So we need that transpiration to be happening. Generally, it's recommended that the soil temperature be above 40 degrees. So, we don't want roots to be frozen. It's got to be warm enough. But there's also, and this is somewhat less proven scientifically, but you don't want the weather to be too hot and dry because the hemlock trees will actually reduce their transpiration during hot and dry periods. For that reason, we basically have a spring treatment season and a fall treatment season. Once things get too cold, we wait until the spring. And then once things get too hot, we wait until the fall. Most of the early research actually that was done on chemical treatment of HWA, a lot of it comes from southern states that are obviously hotter in the summertime. So we're not sure if, there may be sort of a broader period during late spring, early fall when treatments could be effective here in the Northeast. But we're fairly cautious about that and conservative about that because we don't want to do a treatment and have it not be effective. So we do limit things to those spring and fall windows. And the summer hot time is kind of a little bit of educated guess, I guess you would say, when we decide it's okay, it's cool enough, we can start treating again, or we better shut things down, it's getting too hot. So yeah, this is just an example of both of those treatment methods. You can see, the basal bark is just done with a little bit of a backpack sprayer. You just apply the chemical right onto the bark, not to the point of runoff. And generally that's done the bottom 5 or 6 feet of the stem, and works very well, but not appropriate for every situation. So the picture on the right, that's actually Lake George, that water in the background, and we're doing a direct injection to treat a hemlock tree that's directly on the shoreline. You could never treat this tree with basal bark spray. I would dare say you would never choose to treat it with a soil application either, based on its proximity to that lake, and probably not very much soil there. Carrie already talked about biological control. I won't mention too much more about it. She showed this map or a version of it. There is one other Laricobius beetle that has been released in New York State, but not yet in the Adirondacks, and that's Laricobius osakensis, which is a native of Japan. The biotype of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid that we have here in New York State originates in Japan. There is native Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in the Pacific Northwest, on the West Coast, and that is where Laricobius nigrinus comes from. That is the beetle that is been used much more, but Osakcensis is also out there. We hope that it establishes as well. And then on the far right of the upper left picture, Laricobius rubidus is just a native Laricobius species. They may occasionally feed on Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, but they're not specializing in it, so they're not a particularly good biological control. And Laricobius, as Carrie mentioned, it's dispersing. It's doing really well. I suspect if we had more survey data out there, it's dispersing even farther than what we currently know. But the only way to prove that is to get out there and look for it, so that's what we got to do. But yeah, I feel very optimistic about Laricobius nigrinus at least in the more central and southern parts of New York State, and maybe eventually up into the Adirondacks as well. Some of these places where it seems to be dispersing and doing very well now, those releases initially were more than a decade ago. We haven't had Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in the Adirondacks for a decade yet, so maybe we'll get to that point with Laricobius. And then the silverflies, Leucotoraxis. If you all help me out, I'm trying to make Luke a thing. We just call this is Luke. There's two species, Leucotoraxis pinnaperta and argenticalis. Don't worry about that, they're both Luke. This is on the left, one of our releases in the Adirondacks region, being done by our technician, Mike Dolan. They are cute as all heck, and when you open that little jar, they will just fly right out and start digging around in the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid ovisacs, which is great. And again, just repeating what Carrie mentioned, we have not yet proven establishment of these species here. It's early in the game. They're a tough insect to monitor for, which is part of the issue. They're little tiny fruit fly sized things, and they like to fly up to the tops of trees. So trying to recapture them is challenging, to say the least. I know I'm running a little slow here, so let me know, Sean, if I need to speed things up. I'm almost through here. Want to talk a little bit about how DEC chooses where to manage Hemlock Woolly Adelgid and how we prioritize sites and choose sites. Essentially, we have a version of the prioritization tool that Carrie spoke about. Actually, in Lake George, a group of partners formed a coalition and ran a version of this sort of prioritization model using the tool that was originally developed at Cornell, and has sort of, that model has produced a list of areas that are of the highest priority for both conservation and also advanced monitoring. So essentially, right now, we only have Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in the Lake George watershed when it comes to the Adirondacks, so that's where all the priority and focus is for chemical control, trying to hit as many of those areas as possible. If we were to have another outlier site, a place where we find it 40 miles away from where we know it to be again, any site like that automatically is a high priority to us, because we would hope that we still have a chance to influence the course of things in that situation and maybe stop or slow the spread of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in that new area. Right now, Lake George area, the Adirondacks, is considered like the leading edge. It's no longer an outlier. It's well established in that area. So we don't consider it an outlier anymore. As far as what trees we treat, generally, we look at things like, well, is the tree infested? Is the tree healthy enough that it's likely to survive beyond treatment? So we avoid treating, trees that have obvious defect or problems from disease or other things. We also think about the age structure of the stand that we're leaving behind. There's sort of a natural tendency when you're out there selecting trees to go for all the biggest, most beautiful hemlocks you can find and treat those. And it's actually a good idea to treat some of the smaller trees too. If you think about some of the like wind events that we often have in the mountains in the Adirondacks, there's quite a bit of blowdown just this past year in close to one of our Hemlock Woolly Adelgid areas. If you treat only all the big mature trees and they all get blown down by a storm, then you've got nothing left that's got any protection. That younger generation of hemlocks is completely exposed to Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. So we do try to get a mix of younger and older trees, bigger and smaller trees. And then, you know, safety considerations, public safety considerations. Are there campsites or trails or anything adjacent that would make us select this tree over a tree that's maybe a little bit further away from those things? As far as biological control releases, it's completely different ballgame. Biological controls are not aimed at a specific tree or a specific site. The goal is dispersal. The goal is to get the populations going enough so that they will go everywhere and protect everywhere. So we're really looking at things like how much food is there at this site that's alive right now for these insects to eat. Overwintering mortality of HW is something that happens. We're having a real cold snap right now. In the spring, there will be Leucothoraxis available to release, and we're going to have to find a place to release them that has live Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. That might be hard to do in some places. It's going to take effort. So we have to do things like, you know, count how many, you know, sample different areas and count how many survive the winter before, you know, figuring out where we can release them. Obviously, the future fate of a forest is an influence. If this is a state forest stand that's going to be harvested next year and all the hemlocks are going to be coming out, that's not a good place to release biocontrol. And then, you know, we need to be able to monitor these things to figure out, are they establishing? So having the, you know, easy access helps a lot. We certainly have released biological controls in places that aren't that easy to access. But the more we can actually get back to a site and monitor how that forest is doing and see if we can recover those insects and see that they're establishing, the more successful we're going to be in the long run. So we do try to focus on those sites not only that are, you know, public land, so there's, you know, legal public access to them, but also we can, you know, more easily get back to it to do monitoring.
Jason, we probably should wrap it up soon if that's possible, and we do have a bunch of questions in the chat.
Perfect. I will stop my sharing now and do my best.
Awesome, thank you. Ari, why don't you go ahead and get set up, and we'll handle a couple of these questions for Jason. So the first one I have is from Matthew. What non-target insects or other organisms are affected by the chemical treatments?
Okay, so non-target insects can be affected. Imidacloprid is a broad spectrum insecticide. So basically any insect that feeds on the hemlock tree that has been treated could receive a dose. There are a number of insects that do occasionally feed on hemlock trees. So there is the opportunity for those to be dosed, things like hemlock loopers and other defoliators. It's important to note that hemlocks are wind pollinated entirely. They do not have bees or moths or any other pollinating insects that go to them. So there is not an exposure to pollinating insects that comes from treating hemlock trees. If you were to be doing things like soil treatments, I know that in many of the states where they use soil treatments more widely, they'll actually remove the flowering plants from within a 6-foot or 10-foot distance from the treated tree so that they're not exposing pollinating insects to the chemical through those flowering plants.
All right, we actually have two that are related and also related to what you just said. What do you recommend should be the distance from water when treating with imidacloprid basal bark treatment?
Okay, so the easy answer, or there isn't really an easy answer, the actual chemical label doesn't specify a distance. We have used broadly 25 feet from surface water. And I know when state parks does their treatments on state parks land, they have a strict 25 limit. They use contractors to do the applications, and they use 25 feet as just a straight offset. DEC, all of our treatments thus far have been done with internal staff who are certified pesticide applicators. And we might have a bigger offset or a smaller offset depending on factors that the applicator can judge, things like the wind that day, or the slope of the ground. So while we have certainly treated some trees with basal bark spray that were closer than 25 feet to water, maybe more like 15, under the conditions where professional applicators felt that was safe to do without getting drift. We've also gone further away or stopped treatment altogether in some places based on things like wind, it being too windy to treat that day.
All right, well, and speaking of wind, is there an upper limit that you use for wind speed where you would not apply basal bark spray?
Yes, there is. It's not a number. It's basically the effect on the chemical. Are you getting drift away from the target? And that's going to be influenced also by the size of the droplets from your sprayer. So we actually use a nozzle setup that's designed to have sort of larger droplets that are less susceptible to wind, but you can still get days that are windy enough that we judge that we shouldn't be treating using that method on that day. I know there were some days this past fall where we're treating that it was a particularly windy spot that we both days that we were there, we were treating there for a couple of days. We could only treat in that spot until about noon, and then it got too windy, and then we had to move elsewhere.
All right, we have like a 6-part question here, and then we have a 1-part question. So why don't I do the 1-part question? Then we'll give Ari a chance to speak, and then Jason, if you can stick around, maybe answer this question afterwards, that would be awesome. So Pat is asking, how effective is horticultural oil? Our hemlocks in Hemlock, New York, are infested.
So I don't broadly recommend horticultural oil in a forest setting. So the idea here is that there are dormant products, horticultural oils, that you can essentially just soak a small tree with. They're not toxic in any way. They essentially work by suffocating the insect, so you have to really soak every bit of the tree. You will get some HWA mortality with those treatments. If you have something like a decorative hedgerow or something where you can easily treat repeatedly and get the whole thing like good and treated, it's easy for a homeowner to do. It's relatively inexpensive. You will kill some of the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. You're not going to kill them all. It's not something I would try to do if my goal was to, eradicate HWA from the site. But if you're in a, generally densely infested area and you've got small enough trees that you could do yourself, it can work to keep those trees alive longer by killing some of the bugs.
Great, thank you. So Linda, I do see your question here, but let's get to that after Ari. I want to make sure we get Ari a chance to talk here before 11:30. Ari, are you all ready? Ari?
Yeah, I'm all
Okay.
good. Let me know if you're seeing my screen okay and everything.
We're not seeing it right now.
Okay, let me share here. Ah, yes. Something like that, perhaps.
Looking good, thank you.
Nice. So thank you so much to Carolyn and Jason for everything you're doing with Hemlock Adelgid statewide and in the Adirondacks. Really appreciated learning about like the origins of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid and what we're doing on the ground. Thank you so much. I'm Ari Giller-Leinwohl. I'm with APIPP. I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Species Manager. And this section of the presentation is really how folks listening can help. We had a survey season with the Forest Pest Hunter program since 2020. So this webinar sort of serves as the kickoff of our 5th survey season for Hemlock Adelgid. And I'm really excited to talk through the Forest Pest Hunter program, how you can get out there and survey in general, and then how you use IMAP invasives to get that information back over to folks like Jason and I and DEC, so we can really decide where these Laricopius beetles and silverflies get released and where future treatments happen. We've seen some of these maps already, but this is all data here from Forest Pest Hunters last survey season. The green are the positive points, and then the non-detects are super important too. So this is the sort of data set that you all can add to. And it's already been an amazing effort. Thank you everybody that's been involved with this program since 2020. This past calendar year, we crossed over 1,500 hours that folks have spent surveying on the ground, adopting over 66 trails. We'll talk through how you can adopt trails through APIPP's website, but basically it's IMAP invasives that the data goes in, and then that's the central location for the entire state. Every agency is going to look at that. So when I'm referring to these maps and these numbers, it's really all IMAP invasives is that repository, is that database. So we can throw some of these links in the chat, although to be honest, if you go to adkinvasives.com, we've got a Forest Pest Hunter landing page that has, that's how you'd get to a lot of this information. But I figure, well, I've got you all here, can sort of run through what it would look like to adopt a trail, where surveys are most needed, and then how you get that information back over via IMAP invasives. So I'm going to go quickly through it, but it's super important if you're going out in the Adirondacks in the winter. You definitely want to be prepared. The 10 essentials on the right there are really non-negotiables if you're going out, especially with temperatures like they are now. If things break, you don't want to be stranded. Paying attention to the weather, we'll get into that, but I think if folks are on the East Coast, shoot, even down towards the Gulf of Mexico, I think they're pretty chilly right now. And then on the left, we've got a lot of things if you want to carry some extra weight that are never bad to have out with you. If you get stuck overnight, if you want a hot drink, traction, I think, is super important as well. In terms of survey materials for HWA in particular, don't be removing branches and taking things home. This is more like the professional crew set of tools on the right, but a hand lens and a headlamp come in incredibly important. What I tend to do is look underneath the branches and illuminate them with a headlamp, and that's really going to help hone in on those white woolly masses. And that's what you're going to be seeing this time of year. But there's some ambiguity. I'm excited to get to the slides in terms of lookalikes. The hand lens comes in super handy there to hone in on some of those details. Yeah, great weather map. So we talked about some of the gear, but a great idea to tell people where you're going, when you're planning to be back, checking in on the weather. Handy little checklist for y'all. And there's hope. This is the Catskills a couple years ago. Infestations with HWA for 5, 10 plus years now. And some of the trees are definitely still hanging on. So when you're out hiking, what are you looking for to identify a hemlock tree? Jason referred to this like furrowed reddish bark. Looks quite a bit different than, say, an oak or maple tree out in the forest, a bit like a pine. The way I differentiate there is it's going to have green, a pretty dark green needle on it right now versus our hardwoods are going to be bare. Compared to a pine tree, I find the needles of hemlock to be a darker green. So that's a good ID tip when you're out there. differentiating from other conifers. The white dual needles, dual lines on the bottom of the needle is definitely an identifier. Versus a spruce, those needles are sharp. Versus hemlock are not. They'll not roll in your hand. Versus like a balsam fir might roll in your hand. These are pretty darn flat with hemlock needles. And I really appreciate both Carolyn and Jason really diving into what we're looking for. These woolly masses during the wintertime are key. Something I definitely want to point out is you're looking up at that canopy and you might not always be able to access branches. So make sure you're looking at smaller trees too, and potentially anything on the ground, because a lot of times the trees are almost evolved to not have branches lower to the ground. Detailed pictures via IMAP. I'm excited to get to the IMAP section to show you how to do that, but any of these pictures, probably not getting there in the field, but if I saw an observation in IMAP that I was reviewing, these would be confirmations for sure. Another really important note, any observation is good. Detailed pictures are good. This is a quick foray into why. There's a lot of other pests that you might see that could throw you off. Shoot, some have thrown me off this season, especially these spider egg sacs. This is almost when you need the hand magnification. You don't have the woolly structure to these. They're also at a different location. Hemlock Adelgid is only going to be right on this stem versus the egg sac up on the needle. Jason mentioned Hemlock elongate scale. It's a different invasive. But again, that scale is on the needle directly versus on the stem. Generally, I've seen them both colors, this white and some brown gray color. Spittlebug foam. These are things that I feel like if you're going out and surveying a lot, you'll become quite acquainted with, but it's important to be able to differentiate and take detailed pictures is really the crux of it. So here's a fun rundown. This is what we're looking for, but other things you'll encounter. The top right, we've got our Hemlock elongate scale, our spittlebug foam. And similarly, leaf miner damage we have here. Spiders. The spider webbing is quite different than the cottony look of this Hemlock Adelgid here. So that's a quick what you're looking for in the forest, but in terms of reporting it, it's IMAP invasives. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but we've got this guide right on our website, the Forest Pest Hunter section of adkinvasives.com. But essentially, you want to go via a computer web browser and create your login to IMAP invasives and set your jurisdiction to New York. This gives you access to IMAP invasives browser. This is the database. It's free. Most partner agencies use it, and it's citizen sciences can use it too. It's a really cool thing to mess around with when you're looking for something like Adelgid or really any invasive plant or animal in lands and forests throughout New York State. Up here, you have some filters, so you can really hone in on the maps that we've been showing you where Hemlock Adelgid is known to be. For Forest Pest Hunters, make sure you set your project to the APIPP Volunteer Forest Pest Monitoring Project. This lets us keep track of where surveys are going on, and folks like me and partners to go in and approve observations and follow up with any questions we might have. Once you set up your web browser, you can get an app on your phone. This is what you'd be using out in the field to collect your observations. Ultimately, when it's set up on your phone, this is your landing screen that you'd use when you're out hiking. This is where you want to take your detailed pictures, and you can set Hemlock Woolly Adelgid with your list. If this is something you're doing a lot of time or you want to mess around before you go out in the field, I'd recommend that. You can set a custom list, so instead of browsing through every invasive species, it's just plug and play. Hit your Woolly Adelgid, whether you saw it or not, your detailed picture, And then you'll accrue your observations as you go. At the end of the day, once you're back within service or Wi-Fi, you can upload, you can review, make sure everything matches up, add any notes. So a lot going on here, but it's incredibly powerful, free software for online and on your phone. And we've got the tutorial on the ADK website, adkinvasives.com. So how would I approach going out and surveying? You see a grove of hemlocks, and it's probably going to be quite hard to check every tree. So I'd sort of think how much time you're able to dedicate. Maybe if it's you can see the end of the grove, a zigzag pattern through it, checking a number of branches on each tree. This is where your hand lens helps. If you see something that might be it, your headlamp looking up at the underside of the leaves. It's a good time. I really encourage everybody to get out and do it. It's sort of meditative process in the woods. HWA are scary, but it's good work to be doing, and I find it sort of a meditative practice. I definitely want to point out that non-detects are important too. We certainly want to know where HWA is, but it's also incredibly valuable to know where it isn't and where surveys have been done so we're not doubling up on one another. In terms of priority areas, this will be posted on our website. It really lines up with a lot of what Jason was talking about. Our known HWA is really points south of the Tongue Mountain Range. And then we're not quite sure on this blue line. I know Jason was talking about an observation right around here, but that leaves a lot of areas that there could be HWA. And that's where I think the priority survey areas really are for the Adirondacks this season. Our area is close to known infestation, right along that leading line. So we have an Adopt a Trail page on the Adirondack website, but in terms of where the highest priorities are, that's really the purpose of this slide here. You can access this from our website. I also like using the DEC interactive map to plan trips, where once you pick a trail, you can use the maps to plan your surveys. Aerial maps help really hone in on where your evergreen areas are. So I think between the resources that's on the APIPP's website on ADK invasives, which is going to be this, and the Adopt a Trail map, you can actually go in here and adopt these individual trails. And then just general practice, the DEC maps are quite valuable too. So I apologize for the bit of a rush, but I want to get everybody out of here by 11:30. So that's my rundown. And I'm happy to answer any questions and really appreciate everyone's help with Forest Pest Hunters, always in the season. Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. Much appreciated. So before we do questions, I just want to can everyone see my screen here? Quick shout out for APIPP events that are coming up. We have 3 coming up. 2 of them are our midwinter partner meetings. So we do our terrestrial partner meeting. That'll be Wednesday, February 12th. And then we'll be doing our winter aquatic partner meeting on Thursday, February 13th. Both of those are from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Both are hosted on Zoom. They're entirely virtual, no in-person. And this one I'm really excited about, Wednesday, March 12th, 10 to 11:30 a.m., Saving Lakes through Engaged Communities, Success Stories from the Adirondacks. So this one isn't just about lakes, but if you're interested at all in how to get a community effort going, whether it's to save a lake or to save or to help protect a trail, doesn't necessarily even have to be with invasive species. This webinar is definitely for you. We're going to talk a lot about how to engage communities, how to get people involved, how to bring people together for basically a common cause. We're going to have someone from ADK, or actually 2 people from ADK Action will be talking, Kim Tremblay and Christina Hartzell. And then we're going to have someone from Lake Pleasant Sacandaga Association and someone from the Friends of Moody Pond group tell their stories about how they engage their communities to help their lakes. So I think that's going to be a really interesting and valuable webinar. And you can check all these out, more descriptions, registration, all that at www.adkinvasives.com/events. And then last but not least, I want to touch on our outreach materials. These are totally free. We have Protect Your Forest, Protect Your Waters brochures, and then we have Don't Move Firewood brochures as well. We have posters. If you have an Airbnb, if you have a shop or a diner or something like that that people stop at and you want to display some of these materials, either get in touch with me directly or just go on our website and you can order them. And then on the right there, this is really a valuable tool. It's our field guide to terrestrial invasive species of the Adirondacks. It's something that we, APIPP, produced, and it's a nice pocket guide. It covers, I believe it's 26 or 28 species that you're going to find in the Adirondacks, including HWA. And it is set up like a field guide. So it walks you through how to identify plants and then how to look for various invasive species, where you might find them, and all of that. And you can order that, and it's totally free, and you can order that on our website as well, or just reach out to me directly and we can talk more. Okay, and that's all I have. Let's see if we have any more questions in the chat. I know, Linda, you put a bunch of questions in, and I believe Jason did a really good job of answering them. So if he missed anything, please feel free to come off of mute and ask him directly, or just type it into the chat. Have any controls been released in the Finger Lakes, specifically Hemlock, New York? Jason, do you know the answer to that? Or?
Short answer, yes, in the Finger Lakes. I'm not sure how close to Hemlock, but I'm guessing that Hemlock is probably within range of potential dispersal. So I can't say for sure that there aren't Laricobius there, but you could, if we pulled that map back up, I guess we could show where the dispersal has been found. There's a lot of more places that there is potential for dispersal that we haven't looked yet, so they might be there, but I don't know of any releases that happen directly in Hemlock.
And are Larry and Luke? Jason, I think your movement is catching on here. Are Larry and Luke affected by chemical treatments?
Yeah, they can be if they eat prey that have received a dose of the pesticide, but you can manage that by timing the treatments accordingly, so that they are not around when there are prey that are dosed but not yet dead, because they won't go after dead prey.
And those are all the questions I'm seeing in the chat. If I missed your question, please feel free to maybe either retype it or just come off of mute and ask it directly. Well, one thing I would add just to what Ari was talking about with IMAP invasives is it seems more intimidating than it is. I learned how to use it a couple years ago, and it's really not that bad. So just get in there, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. There are a ton of resources for it online. But once you get it up and running, it's actually really intuitive and straightforward to use. Oh, we have another question from David. Is there a 7-year long duration of the chemical, and the infestation is going on 10+ years on the eastern seaboard? Will a second application be part of the strategy? So I think that's a two-part question.
I know that in some state parks, they're already doing their second round of application in places. Other than spreading out treatments over a number of years consecutively, we haven't gotten to the second round of treatment on any of our DEC locations yet. But that certainly is potentially part of the strategy, although you know, the broader strategy is we really want the biological controls to thrive and spread to the point where we no longer need to consider chemical treatment, because that's not a something that is you know, sustainable in perpetuity.
Ari, I think this is a good question for you. Is there a danger of missing the HWA if we are only scouting at lower level of trees? How can we be sure we don't miss it?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. I know like Canadian Forest Service has used a Velcro slingshot mechanism, and this is maybe the best use of a selfie stick that I have heard of to try and get up there in the canopy. Oh, and Jason talked about tree climbers. I know that DEC has had climbers on their monitoring crews to go out and do that. So that's totally relevant for sure in terms of survey, and it could just be in the upper canopy. I don't know prevalence of upper versus lower canopy. So yeah.
If I could add a tip to that, go out after a windy day if you can and check the branches that are on the ground. And you may even find entire trees that have been blown down, and those are great when it's sad, but when I see a fresh hemlock that's horizontal on the ground, I can look at every little bit of it.
I've also seen volunteers using flashlights, even in the daytime, to look up into the tree. And I don't know how much that helps. I know some hemlocks have a pretty dense coverage, right, with their branches.
Yeah, our crews do that as well. A really, really bright light, like an LED headlamp, will increase your visual range a few feet up the tree. One of our technicians, Mikey, was in one of the pictures I showed, actually has started tying the headlamp to the end of a stick so he can hold it up into the tree. And similar to the selfie stick idea, just basically giving you a little bit more visual range. Because those white ovisacs, when they're present, do really pop out under a bright LED light. The brighter, the better.
Yeah, and I think a good message is even lower monitoring is better than no monitoring, right? It's good to get people out there, even if we can't climb the trees.
Absolutely.
Have we tied cameras to birds? No, I'm just kidding. So we have one more question in the chat. Just to confirm, spraying the lower 6 to 7 feet of a tree's bark with the chemicals will kill HWA.
That is the method that we use. That is a restricted use formulation, so that does need to be by a licensed applicator. But if properly timed and properly applied, the chemicals will get moved through the vascular system of the tree and will eventually get up to where the HWA is and kill it.
So yeah, we're a little over our time now, but this is a great, important discussion. Does anyone have any more questions before we say goodbye? All right, I'm not seeing anything. Well, feel free to reach out to Ari or I if you have any follow-up questions. Look for a follow-up email, probably be tomorrow, maybe morning or afternoon. Thank you, Jason, Carolyn, and Ari, for the great presentations. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. And sign up for our upcoming webinars. We hope to see you guys all there. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much. We will.